There's a story that circulates among people who worked in British theatre during the 1950s about a woman who was, by any measure, one of the most celebrated actresses alive, and who was also, on certain nights, someone none of them recognized at all. Colleagues who witnessed it rarely spoke about it publicly for years afterward. What they'd seen felt too private, too frightening, to repeat. The kind of thing you only mentioned in hushed tones to someone who'd already heard the story from somebody else. She was, at the time, married to a man many considered the greatest actor of his generation. Together, they were treated almost like royalty, their photographs filling magazine pages on both sides of the Atlantic. And behind the marriage that the whole world envied was a private struggle that neither of them ever fully found a way to survive. This is the story of the two husbands of Vivien Leigh, a convent girl's quiet first marriage. Long before any of the glamour, there was a little girl growing up thousands of miles from the country she would eventually come to define on screen. She was born in Darjeeling, in British India, in November of 1913, the only child of an English father working in finance and a mother of mixed Irish and Armenian heritage. Her early years were unusually unsettled for a child of her background. At the age of 6, she was sent away from her parents entirely, placed in a convent school in England while her family remained abroad. And for years afterward, she saw her mother and father only during scattered visits, never quite putting down roots in any one place for very long. That instability, oddly enough, seemed to sharpen rather than dull her ambitions. Even as a very small child, before she'd ever set foot in a real theatre, she was already performing for anyone who'd watch, reciting nursery rhymes for her mother's amateur drama circle at an age when most children could barely string a sentence together. From a young age, she told classmates and teachers that she intended to become a great actress, a declaration that most adults around her treated as a passing childhood fantasy rather than anything to be taken seriously. She spent her adolescent years bouncing between schools across England and continental Europe, her father periodically pulling her out of one institution and enrolling her in another as his own travels dictated, picking up fluent French and Italian along the way and developing the kind of cultured, cosmopolitan Polish that would later define her public image. By her late teens, she'd enrolled at London's Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, determined to finally chase the goal she'd been talking about since childhood, surrounded for the first time by other young people who took the craft of acting just as seriously as she did. But almost as soon as she arrived, her path took an unexpected turn. In the early months of 1932, she met a barrister more than a decade older than her, a composed, serious-minded man who moved in entirely different circles than the theatrical crowd she was hoping to join. He did not particularly approve of acting as a profession, viewing it as an unstable, faintly disreputable pursuit for a young woman of her background, the kind of career choice that raised eyebrows among the more conservative legal and professional families he came from. And yet, within the year, the two of them were married, in a formal December ceremony that brought her budding academy studies to an abrupt halt, her acting ambitions quietly set aside, at least for the moment, in favor of the far more conventional life he could offer her. Less than a year after the wedding, she gave birth to a daughter. For a brief stretch, it looked as though she might settle into exactly the kind of respectable, domestic life her new husband had always pictured for himself. But the pull toward performing never actually went away. Even while raising an infant and running a household, she kept quietly angling for small parts, using a slightly altered version of her name, swapping a letter here, borrowing her husband's first name there, to fashion the more memorable stage identity the world would eventually come to know her by. Small film roles came first, unremarkable and easily forgotten, single lines that occasionally ended up cut from the finished picture entirely, But her presence on stage began attracting real attention within a year or two. She had a quality that was difficult to describe, but impossible to ignore. A combination of striking looks and an intensity that seemed to radiate even in minor productions. The kind of screen presence that made casting directors sit up a little straighter, even when the material she was working with was fairly thin. Her husband, for his part, remained supportive in his own reserved way, even as it became increasingly clear that the woman he'd married had no intention of retreating quietly into domestic life. Friends of the couple later described theirs as a genuinely amicable, low-drama marriage, steady, respectful, without the fireworks that would come to define practically every other major relationship in her adult life. They rarely argued, rarely made a public spectacle of themselves, and even decades later, after everything that followed, the two of them remained on remarkably good terms, a rarity among the marriages that would come to define the rest of her story. That steadiness, as it turned out, wouldn't last. Because in the mid-1930s, while performing on the London stage, she caught sight of another actor, a man already married himself, and by her own private admission to friends at the time, she decided almost instantly that she intended to marry him one day. What followed would become one of the most talked-about love stories of the 20th century, and it would also mark the beginning of a chapter far more turbulent than anything her first marriage had ever prepared her for. Almost nobody who watched them fall in love that year could have predicted just how dark that story would eventually turn. The actor who changed everything. His name was Laurence Olivier, a few years older than her, already establishing himself as one of the most gifted classical actors of his generation, with a reputation for bringing an almost dangerous intensity to Shakespearean roles that most performers approached with polite restraint. He'd grown up the son of a strict Anglican clergyman, moving frequently between parishes as a child, and had discovered his own talent for performing on school stages as a boy, eventually earning even his notoriously demanding father's grudging approval. Like her, he was already married to an actress named Jill Esmond, with whom he had a young son. And like her, he seemed to sense almost immediately that something was pulling him toward this other woman in a way that had nothing to do with careful planning or convenient timing. The two of them worked together for the first time in the mid-1930s, appearing opposite each other on stage in productions of Shakespeare, before eventually sharing the screen together as well. And whatever spark had been lit when she'd first spotted him on stage only intensified once they were actually sharing scenes together. Those who watched them work during this period often remarked on an electricity between them that seemed to bleed off the stage and into every rehearsal, every read-through, every quiet moment between takes. By 1937, they'd begun an affair serious enough that both of them made the decision to leave their respective spouses and move in together, well before either marriage had been legally dissolved. In an era when divorce still carried real social stigma, particularly for public figures, this was not a decision either of them made lightly. It took the better part of 3 years for both divorces to become final, years spent living together quietly, while gossip columns speculated endlessly about when, or whether, a wedding might actually happen. During that same stretch, her career took an extraordinary turn that had nothing to do with him at all. An American producer was in the midst of a famously exhaustive search for an actress to play the lead in an enormous historical epic being adapted from a best-selling novel, a search so widely publicized that it had become something of a running joke in Hollywood circles, with newspapers tracking every rumored contender for the role over the better part of 2 years. Hundreds of actresses had been considered and rejected, from established stars to complete unknowns, and by the time filming actually began, the production still hadn't found the woman it needed to carry the entire picture. By the time she entered the running, filming had already begun without a leading lady cast, and the studio was under enormous pressure to solve the problem quickly. She won the role, largely on the strength of a screen test that convinced the production team they'd finally found exactly the fire and unpredictability the character demanded, a quality that dozens of more conventionally polished actresses simply hadn't been able to deliver. The casting decision made headlines around the world almost overnight, in part because she was a relatively unknown British actress, landing what was, at the time, considered the most coveted role in American cinema. Skeptics in Hollywood wondered aloud whether an outsider could possibly carry a story so deeply rooted in American history. But those doubts didn't last long once audiences actually saw the finished film. The film premiered at the very end of 1939, and its impact was immediate and overwhelming. She became, almost overnight, one of the most famous actresses in the world, and the following year, she won the first of what would eventually be 2 Academy Awards for Best Actress. It was, by any measure, the professional triumph of a lifetime. And it arrived at almost the exact same moment that her personal life finally, officially, caught up with where her heart had already been for years. Both of their divorces became final in 1940, and within days, she and Olivier married in a small, deliberately quiet civil ceremony in the United States, witnessed by only a couple of close friends, including the director Garson Kanin and the actress Katharine Hepburn. The public announcement that followed the next day, by contrast, was anything but quiet. A carefully staged press event that confirmed what half of London and Hollywood had already suspected for years. Almost immediately, they were being treated as a kind of theatrical royalty, one of the most celebrated pairings in the history of British and American entertainment. Their names printed together so often in the press that it became difficult, for a while, to think of either of them as an individual performer at all. For a while, it must have felt like the beginning of an extraordinary life together. They worked together frequently in those early years, appearing on stage together in productions of Shakespeare and sharing the screen in a wartime historical drama that would turn out to be their final film together. Colleagues who spent time around them during this period often described a genuine warmth between them, an easy affection that seemed to confirm everything the public already believed about their romance. But even in those earliest years of the marriage, there were quiet signs of something else stirring underneath the glamour. Small, easily dismissed moments that neither of them fully understood yet, and that would eventually grow into something far more serious than either of them could have imagined on their wedding day. Looking back, almost everyone who knew them could point to the exact moment they first noticed something was different. At the time, none of them thought much of it at all. The first warning signs. The earliest hint that something wasn't entirely right came not long after they'd begun performing together regularly, years before most of the people around them would have had any language to describe what they were actually witnessing. During a production of Hamlet in the late 1930s, while she was quietly preparing to go on stage, she suddenly turned on Olivier with a burst of anger that seemed to come from absolutely nowhere, screaming at him without any apparent provocation. Just as suddenly, she went silent and withdrawn, walked out onto the stage, and delivered a flawless performance with no apparent memory afterward that the outburst had even happened. Olivier, by his own later account, stood there stunned, unsure whether to follow her or simply pretend the moment had never occurred. At the time, it was written off as nerves or temperament, or the pressure of a demanding role, the kind of explanation people reached for in an era that had almost no public understanding of mood disorders at all, and certainly no framework for recognizing them in someone who otherwise seemed so composed and capable in front of an audience. But similar episodes kept recurring, spaced out unpredictably enough that no one around her could establish a clear pattern, sudden shifts in temperament that arrived without warning and vanished just as quickly, leaving everyone around her second-guessing what they'd actually seen. In 1939, not long after their relationship had gone public, she frightened those close to her by taking far more sleeping medication than she should have, a lifelong struggle with insomnia tipping into something considerably more alarming. It would be years before anyone connected these episodes to a single underlying condition, and in the meantime, both she and Olivier simply learned to navigate around them as best they could, treating each incident as an isolated crisis rather than part of a larger pattern. The war years that followed brought their own strain. In 1944, while performing overseas to entertain troops stationed in North Africa, she developed a persistent cough that wouldn't resolve, pushing through performance after performance despite feeling increasingly drained, losing a noticeable amount of weight over the course of the tour. Doctors eventually discovered a tubercular patch on one of her lungs, a diagnosis that in that era still carried real fear, given how limited effective treatment options remained. She was ordered into an extended period of bed rest, a diagnosis that would quietly shadow the rest of her life, flaring up again during moments of stress and gradually wearing down a body that was already carrying more than most people around her realized. She recovered enough within the following year to return to the stage, but those close to her noted that she never again seemed to have quite the same physical resilience she'd had before the illness first took hold. That same period brought a miscarriage, a loss that friends later pointed to as one of the moments when her emotional stability seemed to shift into something noticeably darker and harder to manage. She rarely spoke about it directly, even with people close to her, but those around her noticed a change in the months that followed, a heaviness that lingered longer than grief alone typically would. Through the 1940s, she continued working steadily, delivering some of the performances that would come to define her career, taking on demanding roles in both theatre and film, even as these quieter, harder-to-name struggles kept resurfacing beneath the surface. To audiences and critics, she remained the picture of composed, radiant talent. Only the small circle of people who actually lived alongside her saw the cracks beginning to widen. By the end of the decade, she'd take on a role that many who knew her would later describe as the beginning of the end. A part so emotionally consuming that it seemed to blur the line between the character she was playing and the woman underneath, and one that would leave scars far deeper than any of her earlier work ever had. It was a role she'd fought hard to be trusted with, and one that would go on to define her legacy in ways she couldn't possibly have anticipated the day she first accepted it. The role that nearly broke her. In 1949, she took on the London stage production of a new American play, portraying a fragile, unraveling Southern woman clinging to the last threads of her sanity, a role she would go on to reprise in the 1951 film adaptation opposite a young, magnetic actor who was quickly becoming one of the most talked-about performers in Hollywood. The character required her to spend months at a time inhabiting a woman whose grip on reality was slowly, deliberately coming apart, delivering long, emotionally raw monologues about faded beauty, lost love, and a mind she could no longer fully trust. It was, by every account, one of the finest performances of her career, earning her a second Academy Award for Best Actress and cementing her reputation as one of the most fearless, dramatic actresses of her generation. It was also, by her own later admission, one of the most psychologically dangerous roles she ever took on. She told friends afterward that inhabiting that character for months on end, night after night on stage, and then again during filming, had tipped something inside her that never fully righted itself again. The character's descent into delusion and breakdown wasn't something she could simply leave behind at the theatre door each evening. She carried pieces of it home with her, into her sleep, into her conversations, into the quiet hours when she should have been resting instead of replaying the characters unraveling in her own head. Those closest to her began noticing changes that went beyond ordinary professional exhaustion: sleeplessness that stretched for days at a time, followed by crashes of profound low energy, and mood swings that seemed to arrive and disappear without any outside trigger at all. Colleagues who worked alongside her during this period later said it was almost as though she'd opened a door in herself that proved impossible to fully close again. Olivier, for his part, began noticing the pattern more seriously around this time too. While the two of them were working in New York in the early 1950s, he watched her slide into what he later described as a heavy, frightening, depressive state, unlike anything he'd witnessed in their marriage before. He began quietly consulting psychiatrists, trying to understand what exactly they were dealing with, and confided in close friends, including the playwright and composer Noel Coward, that he feared she was heading towards some kind of major breakdown. He was right to worry, because in the early months of 1953, on a film set thousands of miles from home, everything he'd been quietly bracing for finally arrived, and it arrived in a way that neither of them, nor anyone around them, was prepared to handle. The breakdown in Ceylon. In early 1953, she travelled to what was then called Ceylon to begin filming a new picture, a story about a young bride adjusting to life on a remote plantation. It should have been a fairly straightforward production, a change of scenery after several grueling years of stage work. Instead, it became the single most frightening chapter of her adult life. From the earliest days of filming, those on set noticed she seemed unlike herself, arriving exhausted after nights without sleep, sending erratic messages back home to Olivier that read more like fragments of anxious thought than coherent letters, and struggling in ways that had nothing to do with ordinary performance anxiety. She stayed up drinking late into the night and showed up to set the next morning looking noticeably unwell, a pattern that repeated itself with growing frequency as filming dragged on. As the weeks wore on, her condition deteriorated sharply. She began losing track of which character she was supposed to be playing, at times slipping into lines and mannerisms from entirely different roles she'd performed years earlier, as though her mind were cycling backward through her own career without her control, unable to distinguish between the woman she was meant to be that day and the ghosts of women she'd played long before. She became consumed by intense, racing energy that made rest impossible, talking rapidly and erratically for hours at a stretch, followed by periods of complete collapse where she could barely be roused at all. She grew fixated on small, ordinary objects and tasks, at one point becoming distressed over something as minor as a piece of clothing a dresser tried to help her into, reacting with an intensity completely disproportionate to the situation. Colleagues on set, including her co-stars, would later write about the experience in their memoirs, describing it as one of the most unsettling things they'd ever witnessed a person go through, a complete unraveling that none of them had the vocabulary or training to properly respond to. The production ultimately could not continue with her in the role, and arrangements were made to fly her back toward England for treatment, her part in the film eventually recast entirely. The journey itself became its own frightening ordeal. Mid-flight, in the grip of what doctors would later understand as a severe manic episode with psychotic features, she became so disoriented and distressed that the people traveling with her had to physically keep her safe until the plane could land. It was, by every account from those present, one of the most harrowing things any of them had ever witnessed, a stark and frightening reminder of just how far beyond ordinary exhaustion this had become. Once back in England, Olivier made the difficult decision to have her admitted to a psychiatric hospital, where she remained for an extended stretch of treatment. The care she received reflected the extremely limited understanding of mood disorders at the time. Sedation, enforced rest, cold compresses meant to calm an overactive nervous system, and repeated sessions of electroconvulsive therapy, which was, in that era, essentially the only serious medical intervention available for the kind of severe manic and depressive episodes she was experiencing. It was an exhausting, disorienting process, one that left her weakened and confused for stretches at a time, and by the time she was finally released months later, she was diagnosed, formally, with what doctors at the time called manic depression, the condition now more commonly known as bipolar disorder. For the first time, there was finally a name attached to everything that had been happening for over a decade. The sudden outbursts, the sleepless bursts of energy, the crushing lows that seemed to come from nowhere at all. But a diagnosis, particularly in the 1950s, didn't come with anything close to a reliable cure. The available treatments could blunt the worst of the episodes, but they couldn't prevent new ones from arriving, and the entire ordeal placed a strain on her marriage to Olivier that would prove to be more than either of them could ultimately repair. What came next wasn't a clean recovery, so much as a long, uneven negotiation between two people who still loved each other and a condition that neither of them had the tools to fully control. A marriage under impossible strain. In the aftermath of her hospitalization, both she and Olivier tried, in their own ways, to rebuild something resembling normal life. She returned to work relatively quickly, unwilling to let her diagnosis define the rest of her career, throwing herself back into rehearsals and public appearances, almost as though daring the illness to interrupt her again. But the underlying instability never fully disappeared. Periods of calm would give way, unpredictably, to renewed episodes of mania or crushing depression, and the strain of constantly bracing for the next one began to wear on both of them in different ways. Olivier later admitted that he never stopped feeling a kind of low-grade dread underneath even the good stretches, unable to fully relax into ordinary domestic life the way other married couples might. Olivier, for his part, had never been a perfectly faithful husband, even in the earlier, more stable years of their marriage. And as the emotional distance between them widened, both of them began seeking comfort outside the relationship. During the production that had triggered her breakdown, she had grown emotionally attached to one of her co-stars, an actor named Peter Finch, a talented but famously restless man with a reputation of his own for heavy drinking and difficult relationships. Their connection continued, in various forms, for years afterward, and further complicated an already fragile marriage, with Finch reportedly finding himself both drawn to and unsettled by the intensity she brought to everything, including their relationship. At times, in the grip of her illness, she reportedly confused the two men entirely, calling Finch by her husband's name without seeming to notice the difference, a detail that friends who witnessed it found almost unbearably sad. A small, human sign of just how thoroughly her sense of reality could slip. By the mid-1950s, those around the couple could see the marriage was fundamentally unraveling, even as they continued to appear together publicly, maintaining the image of theatrical royalty that audiences had fallen in love with over a decade earlier. Behind closed doors, though, the warmth that had once defined their relationship had curdled into something closer to mutual exhaustion. Two people who still cared for each other, but who no longer had the emotional reserves left to keep propping the marriage up. Olivier eventually found his own path forward, growing close to a much younger actress named Joan Plowright, whom he'd met while working together on stage in the late 1950s. The relationship developed the way so many quiet affairs of that era did, carefully hidden from the press for a stretch before eventually becoming impossible to conceal. The end, when it finally came, arrived the way so much of her life did, abruptly. and while she was in the middle of professional obligations that made it almost impossible to properly process. She was in New York, hours from opening a new play, when word reached her that Olivier wanted a divorce so he could marry Plowright. Friends who were with her that night later said she barely managed to hold herself together long enough to get through the performance. The divorce became official in December of 1960, closing the book on 20 years of a marriage that had once seemed to the entire world, watching from the outside, like the most enviable partnership in show business. What came next for her was quieter, and in some ways, gentler than anything she'd experienced in over a decade. But it would also be considerably shorter than either she or the people who loved her would have wanted. The final years. In the years following the divorce, she found something closer to steady companionship with a British actor named John Merivale, who had known her socially for years and who understood, better than almost anyone, exactly what kind of care she needed. He'd grown up around show business himself and had watched, from a distance, much of what she'd already been through, which made him unusually prepared for the role he now stepped into. He committed himself, in a quiet and largely unpublicized way, to looking after her through whatever episodes still occasionally surfaced, learning to recognize the earliest warning signs of a coming low or a coming high, long before they became unmanageable, and the two of them settled into a relationship that lasted for the remainder of her life, even though they never formally married. Professionally, she continued working steadily through the early 1960s, taking on stage and film roles that reminded audiences and critics alike of exactly why she'd been considered one of the finest actresses of her generation in the first place. In 1963, she won a Tony Award for her performance in a Broadway musical, a reminder that whatever private battles she was still fighting, her talent had never actually diminished. She toured internationally, took on demanding stage roles well into her 50s, and by most accounts approached her work with the same intensity she always had, refusing to let her health or her history slow her down any more than absolutely necessary. Friends who worked with her during these years often remarked that she seemed lighter than she had in a long time, more at ease with herself, even as the physical toll of everything she'd carried for 2 decades continued quietly accumulating underneath the surface. But her body, worn down by years of heavy smoking, recurring bouts of tuberculosis, and the physical toll of her mental health struggles, was quietly running out of road. In May of 1967, during rehearsals for a new play, the tuberculosis she'd first contracted more than 2 decades earlier flared up again, severely enough that she began coughing up blood and was ordered into another extended period of rest. She stepped away from the production entirely, something she'd rarely done willingly throughout her career, a sign of just how serious her doctors considered the relapse to be. She seemed, for a stretch of weeks, to be recovering, resting at her country home, and slowly regaining some of her strength. Those close to her noted she remained preoccupied during that recovery with worry over Olivier, who was separately undergoing treatment for a serious illness of his own, despite their marriage having ended years earlier, still checking in on him and asking mutual friends how he was holding up. Even doctors' warnings against smoking and drinking during her recovery didn't fully take, old habits proving harder to release than the disease itself. On the evening of July 7th, 1967, Merivale left their London home briefly to perform in a play he was appearing in that night, the two of them having settled into a quiet, ordinary evening beforehand that gave no particular indication anything was seriously wrong. When he returned close to midnight, he checked on her and found her resting quietly, and went downstairs to prepare something to eat, assuming, as he had on countless nights before, that she was simply asleep and recovering as expected. When he came back upstairs a short while later, he found that she had gotten up, likely attempting to make her way to another room, and had collapsed. Her lungs, ravaged by the disease that had shadowed her for over 20 years, had finally given out. She was 53 years old. The news spread quickly through London's theatre community that night, and the following evening, in a gesture of collective mourning rarely extended to any performer, every theatre light in the West End was dimmed for an hour in her honour, marquees going dark up and down streets she'd spent decades performing on. Laurence Olivier, despite everything the two of them had been through together, was reportedly deeply shaken by the news, later writing candidly about the guilt he carried over the years he hadn't been able to help her more, and about how, even so many years after their divorce, some part of him had never quite stopped feeling responsible for her well-being. A public memorial service held in her honour at a central London church drew an overflowing crowd of friends, colleagues, and admirers, far more than the building could comfortably hold. She was cremated, and her ashes were eventually scattered near the lake at her country home in East Sussex, the quiet, unglamorous ending to a life that had spent so many of its final years split between spotlights and hospital rooms. Two husbands, two entirely different kinds of marriage, separated by little more than a signature on a divorce decree, yet worlds apart in almost every other way. The first was steady, quiet, and largely unremarkable by the standards of the fame that would follow. A partnership that gave her a daughter, a small taste of stability, and very little of the turmoil that would come to define the rest of her life. He remained, in his own understated way, a constant presence at the edges of her story for the rest of her life, attending family occasions and staying on genuinely friendly terms with the woman he'd once been married to, a rare thread of continuity running through a life defined by so much upheaval elsewhere. The second was the love story the entire world watched unfold in real time, dazzling and celebrated right up until the moment it wasn't, undone not by any lack of devotion, but by an illness that neither medicine nor love, in that era, had any real answer for. It's tempting, looking back, to wonder how differently things might have gone had she been born a few decades later, into an age with actual language for what she was experiencing, medications that could smooth the worst of the highs and lows rather than simply sedating her through them, and a public willing to understand mental illness as something other than scandal or weakness. But she wasn't afforded that kind of era, and instead she spent her most difficult years navigating one of the most punishing illnesses a person can carry, largely in the dark, with only the people closest to her improvising their way through each new crisis as it came. What's left, looking back across all of it, isn't really the story of a glamorous Hollywood marriage at all. It's the story of a woman who spent more than half her adult life fighting a battle almost no one around her, including the people who loved her most, had the tools to fully understand, and who kept walking back out onto stages and film sets anyway, again and again, delivering some of the most celebrated performances of her century, until her body simply couldn't carry her any further. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.